sure because it was carried over from the first trial, which was certainly
the back window was half down. The dog.
with the knowledge of everyone making history.
Yeah,
But it was similar to being at the Versailles Treaty.
Right.
Yeah, the dog had freckles.
Okay.
I'm sure they picked it up too.
Yeah.
Yes, you had a real sense of history. I knew it all along. And in court, it was quite dramatic. One of the most dramatic moments was what led to the conviction of Lightsout on aggressive war counts. We had very little evidence that we could really point to that would establish his culpability in the helping, preparing, and planning the wars of aggression. And he contended that he was a member of the resistance. And there was a small resistance group, primarily in the office of Admiral Canaris, intelligence officers. But the resistance group in Germany was not like the resistance group in, say, France. This was a group within the government of extreme nationalists who, on 3 or 4 occasions, were active against Hitler. And one was just before Munich, you may recall. There was a definite plot to remove Hitler. The reason being the German military knew correctly that they were no match for the Czechs at that time behind the little Maginot Line in eastern Czechoslovakia, Sudetendeutschland. And the only thing that prevented them from acting was the Munich Pact, which, to their astonishment, they were handed the entire country on a platter. And so the resistance movement ebbed and flowed depending upon the success of Germany. Weizsäcker, during the trial, said, I think it was during the trial, rather than an interview before, oh yes, was that he was not a Nazi, nor just a civil servant. His first duty was to the fatherland. And like so many of the German so-called non-Nazis who cooperated closely, mainly from the upper classes, they were fervent nationalists. Interestingly, as you know, Weizsäcker was represented by 4 counsel. He was the only one to have an American counsel, Warren McGee, from Washington, D.C., whom he had specially petitioned for. His lead counsel was Helmuth Becker, who was an excellent, really fine attorney and also a very impressive non-Nazi type. And then he had 2 assistants who historically were interesting. One was Sigismund von Braun, whose brother was Werner von Braun, a rocket specialist.
Sure.
And they were about my age. The other one was, von Braun was, and the other one was Richard von Weizsäcker, who was son of the defendant and who later became president of Germany.
Yeah.
Sort of that. So you can see how difficult it was to try von Weizsäcker. We took the position that despite their personal dislike of Nazis and their excesses, they were fervent nationalists, proud to see the shackles of Versailles removed, and that they served well and ably. Hitler could not, as Jackson emphasized, and as the IMT held, have accomplished what he did without the help of many diplomats, military men, intellectual, educational people, the military officers themselves were split to some degree. And, of course, German aggressions could not have been successful without the very able foreign policy of the Foreign Office, of dissembling, persuading, which led to the Munich Pact, which led to them standing aside in the Ruhr, and then when they invaded Austria. So we did establish at the trial that the invasions of Austria and the invasions of Czechoslovakia were wars of aggression, crimes against peace. Not wars of aggression. And in essence, the court held that a nation does not have to resist when the force against it is overpowering. And a very fine description of what that entailed was given by the witness Radlova, who was the daughter of the then president of Czechoslovakia.
Mm-hmm.
And after the Munich Pact, which Hitler said was the last of his desires, and Chamberlain assured people about peace in our time, Hitler had already prepared, in case, I think it was case Green, for the absorption of the rest of Czechoslovakia. And he put pressure through the Foreign Office on Hungary, for example, to support it. And he promised them Cartho-Ukrainian portion of Czechoslovakia. He put pressure through the Foreign Office on Father Tiso to declare the independence of Slovakia and make it a protectorate of Germany and dismember the rest of Czechoslovakia. And as Mrs. Radlova testified, she and her father were summoned to Berlin at midnight. He was quite frail and elderly, and he was confronted there by Hitler, who loved to work at night. Hitler was a night person, and Goering, and an assemblage of other military national figures, including von Ribbentrop and von Lightsout. And that was the time that Hitler said, in effect, I have given the order for the German troops to march into Czechoslovakia. If you wish to avoid bloodshed, you will sign this document inviting us in to protect you, to protect them against the protectors. And Goering, as he admitted at the trial, the first trial itself, threatened to destroy Prague from the air completely. And this was no idle threat, as the later destruction of Warsaw showed. So the tribunal held that these were crimes against peace, and this was a landmark decision which went beyond what the IMT had. And it makes very good sense.
Sure does.
I don't want to digress, but I might just say there's now a great deal of difficulty trying to include in the permanent international criminal court's jurisdiction wars of aggression. Because there haven't been any definitions of that as yet that have been acceptable. I'll let you follow your questions now.
Well, let's just talk about today. The ICC, the Rome Treaty, your friend Henry King, Ben Ferencz, Whitney Harris were all non-government delegates
Yes.
to there. They speak quite ardently about the United States joining that treaty. They have chosen not to at this point. Do you have a feeling towards that?
Yes, I do. I've been participating to some degree and have been very carefully and closely following it and accumulating a great deal of documents and evidence on it. It is not a question free from doubt. I think I have perhaps a little more objectivity than some, because I have not been involved in the sinews of this development, which started in the mid-70s, when the United Nations group and various other groups really started to try and work toward reaching some compromises. You have to bear in mind that in the Tokyo war crime trials, which took place at the same time as the IMT roughly, but after it, there were 11 judges on the panel, on the dais, you might say. And all of the Japanese defendants were convicted, particularly of wars of aggression and various war crimes. The judge from India, however, dissented from the entire panoply of convictions on the grounds, reflecting his own background, that what Japan did was really legitimate, that these colonizing powers who had seized so much of Asia got their comeuppance, and he voted for the acquittal of all of them. That hasn't been very well publicized, but does reflect a certain attitudinal concern that affects the ICC. Secondly, the General Assembly of the United Nations over the years has been very politicized against the West, and particularly against the United States, on a number of issues. And despite a lot of our economic and financial support of the United Nations. And of course, that's reflected too in our concerns with some of the major powers who are opposed to us in many ways. So I can understand the concerns of people in the Congress and elsewhere, which perhaps were foreshadowed by the concerns against our getting into World War II, that same group of conservatives. All that having been said, I strongly feel that their approach is unrealistic and to some extent based upon a distortion of knowledge. That the treaty, the Rome Treaty, July 17th, 1998, which some 79 nations now have signed, so it's gone into effect, does afford multiple protections to our interests. And I think the one most commonly mentioned is the fact that if a national, say a military man or an official of our government is accused of commission of war crimes, the United States as the country whose citizens are being accused has the right to investigate and try, if trial is merited, the charges. And if they're willing and able, certainly they're able, and willing would mean that it was not a complete perversion of justice.
Right.
To disregard it as perhaps the Cambodian situation reflects. There would be that protection, which is absolute, and the court has no jurisdiction in that case. Now there could be, conceivably, and you get into these remote possibilities, that there would be sufficient political abuse to say, well, the United States whitewashed this, and therefore we in The Hague have jurisdiction.
Mm-hmm.
And then there'd be a question of how do you get control over these people? Because during the investigation, I'm sure they would not be held abroad. And unlike the Nuremberg trials, the ICC has no right to try in absentia, so they have to have possession of the body.
Right.
It's also not realized that the ICC treaty accords almost all the constitutional protections that we enjoy are embodied in the treaty. Most of us, most of them due to our own efforts.
Mm-hmm.
The only one is not trial by jury. However, people fail to realize when they throw around the word, as I've read so often, no trial by jury, that there is no constitutional right to a trial by jury if a citizen is tried outside the United States. And that's a very vital consideration. And that has been upheld by the Supreme Court time and again. And also, from a realistic standpoint, there possibility of abuse. Let's assume that the judges on the panel were from China, Arabia, Saudi Arabia, and Yemen, that they might be prejudiced against the United States. Well, even if, and it's so remote as to almost be talking about how many angels dance on the head of a pin, even if that took place, the United States or any other nation can always withdraw from the treaty upon notice. And that would preserve our position for any future situation.
Sure.
Certainly, too, is the most powerful nation in the world, with staunch allies in Latin America, and most all over the globe, perhaps. The chances of such gross distortion and abuse is just not realistic. And on the other hand, the United States has been the great advocate of an international court. We were the proponents and leading proponents of the temporary tribunals against former Yugoslavia and in the Rwanda situation in the early 90s. And we have supported them with personnel, with finances, and just general approval of the actions taken. I had the pleasure at Bard of having the first prosecutor, chief prosecutor of The Hague at both trials, judge from South Africa's Supreme Court.
Goldstone. The Richard Goldstone?
Yes.
Yep.
Having him there, and I had dinner the last night. I was there. I stayed over till the next day, and I and a staff member dined with him and his wife, and we had a great time, and we discussed the American position, which was very troubling to him and to others. And I find that President Bush's position on it is to exempt the United States would sound the death knell of the court, because how can you exempt one powerful nation, and yet we favor subjugating all other nations? So, although I can understand the concerns and recognize that they may well be asserted at times, I think we have more than adequate protections to protect our own national interests. And having a permanent court which can review war crimes and crimes against peace contributes so much to the world peace and the rule of law, which we are probably, with the English, the foremost proponents of.
Sure. Sure.
Makes little sense.
What's the legacy of the Nuremberg trials?
I guess the legacy of the Nuremberg trials started when, to the surprise of most, in January of 1940, the St. James Declaration was issued by the governments in exile of those countries in Europe that had been overrun by the Nazis and whose people were being subjected to the utmost in suppression and brutality. Those nations' governments said after the trial they wanted a record written, and the rule of law, which the Nazis would never apply, imposed, and that they did not want more or less a killing of the leaders out of hand and just forgetting about the situation. And the legacy, I think, of Mr. Justice Jackson, who was the most towering figure to come out of all the trials, because his words will live in international law and history. But he had a genius for inspiring the best in people as far as their aspirations and vision. And I think the legacy in part is that victors can apply a rule of law. Now, it's been argued by many, not only German nationals, but also a lot of people in this country with hindsight as they sit on their backsides, that it's victor's justice. The fallacy of that is that if Hitler had won, there would be no questions. There would be no justice. There would be no rule of law. No one in Germany has ever challenged, none of the defendants ever challenged the fairness of the trials. But they did not have adequate counsel. Each had at least two. Lightsout, for example, had four. They had the best minds. They had open trial with a free press reporting every incident, poring over every document. There were no secret documents, there was no secret trial. This was law at its supreme high. It was the first time that an international trial had been held that was on questions of world interest. And as Mr. Jackson himself said, you know, what we write large today, we will be judged by tomorrow, with the poison chalice. And it was very true. And so the legacy is that there were 2 points that were entailed in that. Previously, the defense of many in government, officials of government who had committed alleged crimes, such as aggressive war, brutality, was that these were acts of state. And that you tried a state, like Germany, but you didn't try individuals and hold them accountable as long as they were acting within the scope of their duties. And Nuremberg held that there would be individual accountability, that each dictator and each dictator's significant followers would be held accountable as they are today and have since Nuremberg. That was a very important part of the legacy. It also reflected the fact that I've said time and again that international law is intrinsically political in character, because you're dealing between entities, states, and states are represented by individuals, but the clash is between America and China or whatever. And therefore, for international law to contribute to peace, mankind's, so humankind's peace, you have to have a tribunal like the Permanent International Criminal Court, where people who are individually accountable will have to answer for their crimes to an extent, and only to an extent. It's a deterrent, but it also is a landmark and milestone for the future. And in order for that to happen, you have to have the political will to desire the rule of law. And that's where I have real trouble with Mr. Bush's position,
Right.
that he is meaning well, but his interpretation of the rule of law means that we will not be accountable to anyone but ourselves. This is like saying that Nazis could only be tried by Germans, as they were. Now, in the earlier days, then the German government might be asked to try their own people for crimes that they committed. And even in our trials, the lenity of the sentences, which we mentioned earlier, would have been much less if the trials had taken place earlier in the decade. There would have been many more convictions,
Right.
and the severity of the sentences. And secondly, as you well know, although it was done in the dark of night, literally, by 1958, there were no war criminals in the jails, all Germans were released,
Right.
despite the fact that a number of them had been sentenced to death, I think 29, and only 5 of the worst, the Einsatzgruppen leaders and I think the head of Auschwitz, were actually hanged. And this was because the German government, which, by the way, while our judges were pondering their decision in the fall of 1948, the German counties were asked to convene in the West and to prepare a constitution for a German government. And the West German government arose like the phoenix.
Right. That's right.
In May, after our decision of April 23rd. So these two contradictory, and the price that Adenauer and the nationalists exacted was that they would not create a military force after Germany was created unless all war criminals, and they didn't care what crimes they committed, were released. And they were.
Yeah, interesting. You've been spectacular and insightful, and I can tell you, though I probably will never be able to put this on tape, but of all the people I've talked to, probably have a better idea and a better grasp of what was going on in the big picture than anybody I've interviewed.
Well, thank you.
I mean that sincerely. I mean,
This was very interesting.
so we probably need to conclude with you talking about the Duchess of Windsor, since your wife brought that up.
Yes, I told you I had been in Paris.
Right.
I had been in Paris many times. At that time I could speak fairly good French, and I was also a bachelor, and had spent a number of, had sown some wild oats earlier in Paris. I was always fond to return to that city, and it was so pretty. But I always stayed at the Ritz at the Place Vendôme, and believe it or not, in those days, I would have a suite there. And in fact, it overlooked the garden where they serve food outside. It was about the 3rd or 4th floor. And it only cost $10 a day, which is quite a contrast to what it costs nowadays, because in recent years I priced the same place and it was much higher. But I was down talking to concierge one day, and I used to be in and out so much that I was well known there. And he had, there's not much of a lobby in the Ritz. They're so elegant that you don't need a big lobby to impress people. And the concierge is behind an ordinary small desk. And we were chatting, and I didn't realize that there was someone behind me. So when I had finished, I stepped back, and I hit this woman, who didn't expect me to do what I did, and I had no idea. And I knocked her, and I swept around, and she was literally falling. I grabbed her. And I almost dropped her when I saw who it was. It was the Duchess of Windsor. Of course, she's very recognizable.
Sure.
I've never seen her before, but, you know, from her pictures and all. Well, you can imagine me. I felt like a clumsy oaf. I apologized all over the place. She could not have been more gracious. And she started to ask where I was, what was I doing here. Oh, was I at the trials? How very interesting, and so forth and so on. Where were I staying? Oh, well, would I like to come to cocktails? No. To tea. She's having a small group that they're staying at the hotel. I hadn't realized they were staying there until then. So, you know, I thought this was great, so I said I would be very pleased. And I went up in this small group, it was about 40 people, in this huge suite they had. I don't know how many rooms. But she was very delightful. When I came to the door, I was sort of floored because I hadn't expected a gathering of this nature. And she took me around, introduced me, and in fact, I met the Duke. And I never had trouble talking with anyone, but I was almost nonplussed. I met him, and he was very nice. He smiled. He was quite a bit shorter than I had anticipated. And I would say something to him, like, what a lovely apartment. And he said, yes. And he would smile. But that was it, you see. So the ball is thrown back to you, and you don't know the man, and you said, are you fond of Paris? Instead of him telling, yes, because so-and-so, I've been here so many times. He said, yes. Well, this went on and there about everything I could think of. I was getting desperate too, because it's very embarrassing. You know, he'd just say that one word, and that was it, or he'd say no. But he never followed it up, and he made no attempt to have a two-way conversation. So I was very pleased when she spotted me, sort of floundering, I think. She came over and said, I have someone I'd like you to meet, and that was it.
Yeah. Oh, wow. What an experience. Well, you can say something a lot of people just dream about or watch on TV. You met him.
Yeah, it was delightful. We had a very interesting experience in South Carolina. They had a very fine conference at the University of South Carolina in October, I think, of 1998. And all the speakers were former prosecutors, as I had mentioned, at the trials. And the people could not, in the community, had not been more responsible. I didn't realize, and the others didn't, that they had been preparing for this for weeks, and that it was in the newspapers for weeks, we were coming. And when we spoke, there was an average, we spoke in the auditorium, I think, of the law school of the university, an average about 500 for each session.
Oh, my word.
All-day sessions.
Wow.
And without our knowing it, and without the play rights knowing it, just by happenstance, in a town quite close to Columbia, South Carolina, where the university is, there's a small town, and they have a very well-known playhouse there. And the Broadway production of Goering, it was off Broadway, was opening there. We got started on a Tuesday, and I think it opened Wednesday. On Wednesday night, we were the guests of honor at this showing of the Goering play. And it was a magnificent play, by the way. It was Hermann Goering to a T.
Yeah.
And I have some clippings on it and some pictures of it. But they were very staunch supporters of very interested in it. It was quite amazing. And speaks well of it.
Did you keep any archives? When you were over there, did you, whether it was your briefs that you prepared or...
Yes, but I gave, I don't know why, I guess it's being a bachelor at the time. I had, for example, a complete set of all of the trial volumes. And I think I gave them to Harvard Law School with the exception of one volume that dealt with case number 11. And most of my personal papers and all, I retain very few. Unfortunately, I have, I think, one brief, my brief against von Weizsäcker, and I think I've given away all the other. I had all the briefs and all of that stuff.
Sure.
But my circumstances were that I was just coming back and reestablishing myself. And I guess I didn't really think that mine were anything but duplicates, so that there really was very little point in retaining them.
Sure.
But I do have some things. I have, I did, oddly enough, during my career at AT&T, and maintained complete archives, which I still have, although I reduced from 2 40-foot shelves of files to about 6 feet of files, much to my wife's delight. And I have some photographs of a few scenes at the trials. I had a lot of them, but I didn't keep many of them. I don't retain many things.
You have a picture of yourself at the podium?
Yes.
Do you? You know, and what I'd love to be able to do is perhaps make copies of those, because this will be the William Kaming little file at the Robert Jackson Center. I would just to be able to get copies of what maybe some of the stuff you have. I'd be honored to have that there.
Oh, I'll be glad to send it. Let me see. Do you have a minute?
Sure, yeah, absolutely.
Well, I think I'll...
Dennis Quaid and Julianne Moore appear to be leading the perfect 1950s suburban life in Far From Heaven, but each harbors deep hidden secrets leading to a